It's the conflict that's captured the world's attention for nearly 2 years running. The Israel-Hamas war has ravaged the Palestinian territory of Gaza, claimed an estimated 50,000 lives or more, and proved to be among the most controversial and polarizing conflicts in recent global history. But as we speak, the situation in Gaza is growing darker and more ruinous than it has ever been, with a massive Israeli clearing operation now underway and intended to expel the Palestinian population from nearly the entire Gaza Strip. Bombing raids are constant. There's hardly any food or medicine for months, and all indicators are that this crisis is only going to get worse. So here's the situation in Gaza right now, what Israel is doing, how the world is reacting, and why this war might continue for months or even years to come. On Sunday, May the 18th, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, announced the start of, quote, extensive ground operations in the Gaza Strip. There, as warplanes thundered overhead and dropped yet more explosive munitions onto populated areas, Israel's long-awaited endgame got underway. The offensive is known as Operation Gideon's Chariots, approved by the Israeli government in early May and comprising assaults by land, sea, and air, with the objective to end the Israel-Hamas war once and for all. Over the course of the operation, the IDF intends to defeat Hamas outright, dismantle its military and institutions of civil governance, and take direct control over the entirety of the Gaza Strip while moving civilians into tightly controlled zones where Hamas fighters and sympathizers can be filtered out. Critically, according to Israeli officials themselves, the release of Israel's remaining living hostages in Gaza and the recovery of the remains of hostages who've been killed is no longer a top priority. Instead, IDF troops are to surge into the Gaza Strip in massive numbers, destroy all the buildings, homes, and human infrastructure that remains, and bury Hamas, both literally and metaphorically, in the rubble. In practice, the operation got underway 2 days prior, when the IDF advanced on the central Gazan city of Deir al-Balah for the first time since the start of the war. From there, the IDF began clearing operations in several locations at once, moving infantry divisions and heavy armor into zones near Rafah, Khan Yunis, and Gaza City. According to satellite imagery, large parts of those cities have already been reduced to rubble by Israeli bombing campaigns, and now, according to reports from within the IDF itself, Israeli troops are moving through that rubble, block by block, with a few key objectives. They'll clear out any areas that they can easily access to ensure that no Hamas fighters are left alive. They'll destroy standing or partially standing structures outright by way of explosives, tank fire, or armored bulldozer. And in the event that the IDF can identify openings to Hamas's surviving network of tunnels, those tunnels will be sealed off under piles of rubble, leaving those inside to flee elsewhere or perish. Israel hasn't directly disclosed the actions of its soldiers, describing a policy of intentional ambiguity in order to preserve as many lives as possible. But while the tactics remain vague, the strategy has now been confirmed to take direct control of the vast majority of Gaza's land area, cleared of civilians, and to hold that ground in order to ensure that Hamas cannot access civilian areas or humanitarian aid. If the IDF's approach is successful, then any Hamas fighters who've survived thus far will be isolated, left exposed, starved, and hunted down if they manage to endure. Civilians, meanwhile, will be sent to one of 3 small zones in the north, central, and south of Gaza, respectively. At the same time, Israel has pursued its air war in Gaza with an even greater ferocity than it's displayed in the past. Overnight on May the 18th, Israel launched a wave of airstrikes in which it claimed to have hit over 670 Hamas targets. Some 400 people or more were killed in the airstrikes over a single night, and more than 1,000 others were injured. The following day, Israeli strikes killed over 130 people and destroyed one of the few remaining repositories of medical supplies that still exist within Gaza. Every day since, Israeli airstrikes have killed at least several dozen Gazans, anywhere from 30 or 40 on some days to over 100 on others. Particularly notable strikes include a strike on the 20th of May on a school housing displaced families, a strike on an important hospital on the 23rd, a strike that killed 9 of the 10 children of a Gazan doctor in Khan Yunis on the 24th, and a strike on a school that killed 36 and wounded 35 in Gaza City on the 26th. Just as important and just as troubling has been Israel's handling of humanitarian aid. For a period of 10 weeks leading up to the new operation, Israel instituted a complete blockade of aid flowing into Gaza, and while Israel has since let small handfuls of trucks into the territory, those aid deliveries are woefully inadequate to address the scale of need. Major humanitarian organizations have refused to keep working under Israel's terms, insisting that the deliberate cutoff of aid to civilians is an unacceptable violation of human rights and is unjustifiable as a tool to conduct a military offensive. And while Israel has started working with a replacement, that replacement has drawn intense skepticism and concern from both Palestinians and the international community. On Monday, May the 26th, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation announced that it had started operations at distribution centers in southern Gaza, but according to reports on the ground, very few Palestinians have shown up, although desperation won out the following day when nearly 500,000 meals were reportedly handed out. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is a US-backed organization that, according to Hamas, will use biometric identification and tracking tools to screen Gazans who approach their distribution centers to get aid. These tools are purportedly meant to identify people with links to Hamas or who may be foot soldiers within the group, but many Gazans fear that if these tools are unreliable or based on unreliable data, then they'll be rounded up in dragnet operations meant for somebody else. Israeli officials have directly acknowledged the plan to screen people receiving aid with the express purpose of denying and excluding people with suspected connections to Hamas, and according to other global aid groups, anyone receiving food aid will have to submit to facial recognition software. The foundation has been boycotted by the UN, the Red Cross, and other major aid organizations, and even its own former executive director submitted a surprise resignation the day before aid distribution began. According to the executive director who resigned, Jake Wood, the foundation will not be allowed to operate independently. Now, Israel's recent conduct inside the Gaza Strip has been stunning, even by the standards of this ongoing conflict. But just as stunning and just as unprecedented is the growing international outrage over Israel's actions, not just from its longtime adversaries, but from some of its closest allies. According to a range of international sources, those countries have now lost any remaining patience with Netanyahu over the 1-2 punch of Israel's relentless continued assaults on Gaza and the cutoff of humanitarian aid from the territory. In Europe, the United Kingdom has suspended trade negotiations with Israel, while France is expected to meet soon with Saudi Arabia on a two-state solution and then take the seismic step of formally recognizing a Palestinian state. The leaders of both nations, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, came together in a joint statement with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on May the 19th to condemn Israel's conduct, and we'll quote here, "We will not stand by while the Netanyahu government pursues these egregious actions. If Israel does not cease the renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid, we will take further concrete actions in response." The Prime Minister of Spain referred last week to Israel as, quote, "a genocidal state," while the Netherlands, traditionally a stalwart ally of Israel, is now leading an effort in the European Union to reconsider the bloc's entire trade approach with Jerusalem. German leader Friedrich Merz told a conference on Monday the 27th that the suffering of civilians, quote, "can no longer be justified," and that humanitarian international law is clearly violated by Israel's conduct. Netanyahu has responded to European leaders with fire and brimstone, accusing the leaders of France, Canada, and Britain of being, quote, "on the wrong side of humanity and on the wrong side of history." But perhaps the loudest signal of all that things are changing among Israel's allies is the fact that after so many occasions in which they've been forced to swallow criticism in the past, this time Netanyahu's outrage has left them unmoved. But easily, the most important reversal of all comes from the United States. According to Axios, the Trump administration had privately urged Netanyahu to draw down the war and allow humanitarian aid shipments to resume. That is a major shift for an administration that has made unconditional support for Israel into a political cornerstone and that recently advocated depopulating Gaza and transforming it into, and we'll quote again, the Riviera of the Middle East. And although Trump has yet to take his disagreements public, his recent trip to the region sent a message to Jerusalem loud and clear. In a 3-stop tour across Middle Eastern petrostates, Trump drew the US closer to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Emirates and announced deals with each nation worth many hundreds of billions of US dollars. Netanyahu, by contrast, didn't even get a visit. And as that international outrage was growing to a fever pitch, an investigation by the Associated Press added yet more fuel to the fire. That report, published on May the 24th, drew on several interviews with former IDF soldiers and Gazan Palestinians and alleged that the IDF had been using Gazan civilians as human shields since the start of the conflict. Now, we'll link to the report in the description of this episode, but even the short summary is horrifying. As the AP describes it, the IDF has routinely forced Gazan civilians into houses and buildings that they suspect may be mined, booby-trapped, or set up as an ambush point for Hamas militants to use. Those civilians, referred to as mosquitoes, would then be passed around from unit to unit in a practice that the IDF allegedly used in, quoting the AP, nearly every platoon. According to soldiers interviewed, Israel justified the practice because it, quote, sped up operations, saved ammunition, and spared combat dogs from injury or death. Israel's denied the allegations and insists that the use of civilians as shields is prohibited. But in a war where Israel has constantly and accurately accused Hamas of hiding behind the civilian population of Gaza, Israel now stands credibly accused of the very same thing. A whistleblower group of former Israeli soldiers have confirmed the AP's claims after running their own separate investigation. In Israel, public opinion clearly seems to have shifted strongly against the war and the Netanyahu government. In a recent round of polling, about 70% of Israelis endorsed an end to the war in the Gaza Strip in exchange for the release of the hostages still in Hamas captivity. Another Israeli poll found that only about 6 in 10 supported a quick end to the war, but that a mere 25% of Israelis supported an occupation of Gaza. High-profile political figures in Israel have been increasingly emboldened to condemn their own country's conduct in Gaza. Quoting former IDF Deputy Commander Yair Golan, Israel is on the way to becoming a pariah state, like South Africa was, if we don't return to acting like a sane country. A sane state does not wage war against civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not set itself the goal of depopulating the population. End quote. Said Moshe Yaalon, a former Minister of Defense, on the hobby of killing babies that Golan had referred to, quote, "This is not a hobby, but a government policy whose ultimate goal is to hold on to power, and it is leading us to destruction." End quote. Again, Netanyahu has responded personally with fire and brimstone, as have his political allies and supporters, but yet again, their condemnations simply haven't had the same impact as they would have just a few short months ago. And at the same time that the Netanyahu government's actions appear to be driving a shift in public opinion, new expert analysis continues to suggest that the death toll in Gaza may be considerably higher than either side has acknowledged. As of early May, the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health has counted nearly 53,000 people killed over the course of the war, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants. Israel currently estimates that it has killed up to 17,000 Hamas fighters by that time. But a recent study by The Lancet, cross-referencing both the Israel-maintained list and the Gaza Health Ministry list with their own list tracking deaths from traumatic injury through social media obituaries, found a shockingly small overlap in victim counts between those three lists. What that means, in practice, is that deaths reported in one list are likely not counted in the others, and that the death toll could be anywhere from 46% higher to a full 107% higher than the death toll put out by the Gaza Health Ministry. According to The Economist, that could mean that anywhere from 77,000 to 109,000 Gazans may have been killed over the course of the war, up to 5% of Gaza's pre-war population. It is an imprecise counting mechanism, prone to errors that could lead to an undercount or an overcount, but either way, the study indicates that the highest official death toll is probably still a gross underestimation. Right now, the situation is incredibly bleak for the people of the Gaza Strip as the IDF and the Netanyahu government move in pursuit of a crushing total victory. But the situation is growing more difficult for Israel too, as Netanyahu finds himself increasingly abandoned by international partners and by his own people. With both sides in need of a way out, it would be fair to suppose that a breakthrough might be on the horizon. But right now, that just doesn't seem to be the case. Unfortunately, as we and a chorus of global experts have reiterated for months, there is reason to believe that Netanyahu has continued the war until now for political reasons. Netanyahu is on trial in 3 separate corruption cases. He's recently come under fire for dismissing the head of Israel's domestic security agency after even more political trouble emerged, and he's not believed to have the support to renew his political mandate in a new election. He's repeatedly refused to form new agreements to secure the release of hostages, even though 140 hostages have been released through ceasefires or other forms of deal-making, and just 8 have been rescued alive by the IDF during combat operations. Netanyahu has always been a very savvy political operator, slippery at times, and he's demonstrated a keen interest in retaining power that would seem to suggest he'd extend his time in office through suspect means if necessary. That is a suspicion shared by a majority of Israelis, according to an Israeli TV poll aired last Friday. According to that poll, 55% of respondents believe that Netanyahu's main goal right now is to remain in power at all costs, as opposed to less than 40% who alternatively endorsed that his goal was to return Israeli hostages or win the war in Gaza when asked different versions of the question. 53% agreed that the only reason that Israel hasn't reached a deal to secure the release of more hostages is a matter of Netanyahu's political interests. Half the respondents to the same poll endorsed an even more troubling possibility that a set of national elections in Israel scheduled for next year could be cancelled on the basis of a national emergency. If that really is Netanyahu's objective, to run out the clock long enough that he could even avoid a round of elections, then the prognosis for Gaza should be even more grim than it already is. In that world, Netanyahu would have to extend the war long enough to justify cancelling elections that are scheduled for late October 2026, and then ensure that the national emergency continues long enough that at a bare minimum, it would be too late to simply go back to that scheduled date when the emergency concludes. That is especially salient because, at least right now, the idea that Netanyahu could win such an election is laughable. Months ago, before Israel's newest phase of clearing operations were even announced, polling already showed that 70% of Israelis don't trust the Netanyahu government. A similar number would like him to resign. Those are very problematic numbers for a leader who actually saw a swell in support during a part of the war and who now must understand that public opinion has soured on his leadership even when united against a common enemy in Hamas. If Netanyahu is indeed looking to cling to power by any means necessary, then he'll only be emboldened by the ultra-nationalist members of his own political coalition. They're likely to suffer even more than Netanyahu in public backlash against the war, and they aren't likely to get another shot at being part of the nation's ruling coalition for some time. As a result, they too are incentivized to preserve Netanyahu's mandate to lead. So are senior officials within the IDF who may fear domestic or even international prosecutions for their actions if a new Israeli government were to take command. Facing allegations of crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing and genocide, those senior leaders have real reason to try and extend their protection under the Netanyahu political umbrella for as long as possible. And without an Israeli government that's willing to come to the table, with Operation Gideon's Chariots already underway, there's no clear reason to believe that Netanyahu can't draw out the war even further. In that world, where the violence only continues from here, mass Palestinian expulsion from Gaza appears to be on the table, and the death toll only continues to rise. The situation in Gaza is getting worse day after day, and if any relief is coming, then it'll have to come from someplace entirely unforeseen. Thank you for watching.